Hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to the next CMU Insights Lockdown webinar. Just gone 2:30 here in London, so we should better get underway. Again, a huge number of people logging in from all over the world. People are already giving me the thumbs up, which I'm assuming means that you can both see me and hear me. Hearing me is more important, to be honest with you. So what we will do, the routine little lo-fi tech check that I like to do. So if people in the chat window on the left-hand side of the screen, if you can just say hello, bonjour, guten tag, tell me where you are, that you're receiving me. Look at that. We've got lots of people coming in there. Well, oh, look at that. New York, Berlin, Scotland again, Amsterdam, everybody and everywhere. So hello there, welcome to this webinar. Some of you may have already done another lockdown webinar. You know the format by now. Some of you, this may be the first time you have been here. I'm sorry I am a little bit silhouetted here in the camera today. That's because the sun here in London today is really strong outside my window. So I've got, got a sort of angelic light behind me, which then means I'm a bit of a silhouette in front. We probably should have got some stage lighting in. But I'm only going to be here at the top of the screen for the first few minutes, and then when we get going, we'll hone in on the slides. So for those of you who haven't done one of these webinars before, basically it's in 3 sections. A very short section art, then a big main presentation in the middle, and then a final section. So the first section, I'm going to very quickly talk to you about what I think is the most interesting news story in today's CMU Daily. It's a little bit of copyright stuff for you. Then we'll get into the main presentation, which actually we've pre-recorded. So my colleague Sam is also on the line. He will press play and we'll have the main presentation today, all about the evolution of record deals and the changing relationship between artists and labels, artists and distributors, artist managers, labels and distributors, and these companies that call themselves label services. So that's what the main presentation will be about today. And then in the final section, whatever time we have left at the end, we'll answer as many questions as we can. So if you want to ask a question, you can do that at any time. At the top of the screen, if you're looking at this on a desktop browser, possibly to the left-hand side if you're in one of the mobile apps, you'll see a little blue button with a question mark on it. You can click that at any time and type in a question. And if you can put your questions there rather than in the chat window at the side of the screen, it really helps, because as the main presentation is playing, me and Sam are going to be organizing those questions and getting some answers together. So if you can try and remember to click on the blue little button with the question mark on it for your questions, that would be great. And then the final section, we'll answer as many questions as we can. I mean, there's 70 of you tuning in today, so the chances are we won't get through all of your questions. But I am actually also doing write-ups of some of these questions. I'm still working on it, but tonight I'm going to finish it all. So for anyone who's been to any of the lockdown webinars this week, we're going to publish on the CMU website a Q&A based on the questions you've been asking. So that's the general gist of the session. Just a couple of other logistical points. The slides that you're seeing here today, you can download. We sent you a link this morning to the same email that had the link to where you accessed the webinar. There was another link to the CMU Insights website, and if you go to that web page there, you'll need a password, then you can download a PDF of the slides. So everything you're seeing here today you can have. And then the last thing to tell you is we're recording this. So my colleague Sam has just reminded me that if you don't know where that email address is, or that email is, and you've lost the URL, don't worry, you'll get another email from us after the webinar which will remind you with the link you need in order to access the slides. And in addition to that, we're also recording the session. So if for any reason any of you need to disappear, check an email, or maybe there's some technical issues over the internet between us here in London and you wherever you are in the world, then there's a recording of this. And again, we will send you the link later on today to where you can access that. That, I think, is all of the logistics, other than me saying hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us on this, our third of our lockdown webinars. And before we get going with the main presentation, I'd just like to give a little name check each day to the big news story of the day. Because here at CMU, oh, by the way, I'm Chris Cook from CMU. It's just occurred to me that I didn't introduce myself. Hello to the people who've never been here before. I'm Chris Cook from CMU. And as well as running training sessions like this and webinars and all sorts of other ways that we support people in the music industry and the wider music community to help them navigate and understand the business of music. Obviously, we also are media. We report on the big news stories of the moment through our daily bulletin, comes out each day around about 11 a.m. London time, and our weekly podcast set list. And I just want to pick out a story which is in today's daily, which I think is worth checking out. It's a copyright story, so almost relevant today, because we're talking about the copyright side of the music industry today, the record industry. Last week, a big online debate took place, organized by UNESCO, a division of the United Nations, talking about the impact of COVID-19 on the creative community. It's a very interesting debate, 2 hours long, but it is interesting. In the Daily, we have a link to where you can go and watch the full thing. But in the midst of that, actually during the Q&A section, Jean-Michel Jarre, the famous musician and composer, who's also president of an organization called SISAC, which is kind of a global grouping for all the songwriter collecting societies around the world. So he was there with 2 hats on, one as a creator in his own right, one as a campaigner through SISAC. And amongst the various things that he suggested was this idea of eternal copyright. So copyright doesn't last forever. So copyright, the legal principle that allows creative people and their business partners to create their to control their creative output. That's what copyright does. Copyright provides those controls for a period of time. And then at the end of that period of time, the copyright ends. We say the work has become public domain. And from that point onwards, anyone can do whatever they like with your song, your recording, whatever it is, without getting your permission. And that's how copyright works. But Jean-Michel Jarre was saying, what if we change the rules so that copyright lasts forever? However, at the end of the traditional copyright term, so 70 years after a recording was released, life plus 70 years for a songwriter and a composer, what if the rights went to a global fund, and then the money that work created, he gave the example of Beethoven's Ninth, the money that work created was then given out in grants to fund the creative community. A very interesting, slightly radical idea. It ain't going to happen anytime soon. Certainly in the context of it being a way of supporting artists through COVID-19, it ain't going to happen. But an interesting idea. So do go and check out that story in today's CMU Daily. And we link through to where you can watch Jean-Michel Jarre talking about it online. Also in a daily, we have a London-based lawyer who raises some of the issues with that proposal. So you can check that out too. So that's today's news, but let's get on with the main presentation, because today's main presentation is slightly longer than normal. So we'll get on with the main presentation, and then with whatever time we have left at the end, we will answer as many questions as you can. It might mean we overrun ever so slightly. We're meant to finish at 3:20. If we do, as I say, you can always come back and watch this on demand. So if you do have to log off, bang on 3:20, don't worry, you can come back and watch the Q&A bit at your leisure. But what I'm now going to do is I'm going to ask my colleague Sam, who is pressing the buttons to fire up the main presentation, which I pre-recorded, and we'll watch it all about the evolution of label deals. So Sam, if you can do that. So this is the CMU Insights webinar, all about the evolution of record deals. We're going to talk about the ins and outs of how the deals that are done, the contracts that are agreed between artists and record companies, how those work, but crucially how they have been changing over the last 20 years and especially the last 10 years. We're going to talk about the role of music distributors and label services companies and how that has changed the ecosystem so that artists now have multiple business partners that they could choose to work with around the recorded music side of their artist businesses. And we're going to see how that increase in choice on one level is brilliant for artists and their management teams, but also means that some tricky decisions now need to be made as artists look to better exploit, manage, market and monetize their recorded content. That's the brief for the next 35 minutes. As always, we're going to go through this in 10 neat steps. So I have 10 key things to say about the evolution of record deals, and through those 10 things, we'll do all the things that I've just said. We'll get it all covered. And so we begin with this. Number one, most of you already know this. Record labels work with artists on their recorded music, but we should acknowledge that often a label's role, certainly a traditional label's role under a traditional record deal, goes some way beyond just expanding and exploiting the recorded music. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start off by recognizing that an artist who is recording music, writing music, performing music, building a fan base, what the music industry would traditionally call a featured artist, what we tend to now call as a frontline artist. An artist has many different revenue streams, many different ways of turning their creativity, their songwriting, their recordings, their performance, their fan base into money. And we always split those revenue streams up into 3 key groups, which are the key groups represented here. The intellectual property or copyright, revenue streams, the live performance revenue streams, and the fan relationship revenue streams. And any frontline artist will be making money in all of these different ways. When we're talking about IP, intellectual property, we're really talking about copyright, although as it says there, possibly a little bit of trademark as well. And obviously artists are creating lots of different kinds of IP, of intellectual property. So those of you who've done our copyright sessions will know, and the rest of you, you've probably come across this before, that as far as copyright law is concerned, songs and recordings are two separate things. So artists are creating two bodies of copyright, song copyright and recording copyright. But copyright also protects everything visual, photography, illustrations, etc. So it's a third body of copyright. And then we have the notion of trademarks, which is the branch of intellectual property that allows artists to protect their name, their logo, their identity. So artists are creating all of these different kinds of IP. They then take all that copyright and those trademarks and they create products and services out of it. So in a more pragmatic way, when we're looking at the intellectual property side of the music industry, we're talking about selling physical discs, we're talking about downloads and obviously now increasingly streaming services. We're talking about synchronization of music into movies, games and ads. We're talking about the money that comes into the music industry through TV and radio. We're talking about live performance. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Why am I talking about live performance under intellectual property? Well, because when you stage a live performance of music, you're actually exploiting the performing rights, certainly in the song copyright. Public performance is when recorded music gets played in public. Again, the copyrights are being exploited because the music is being played in a public space. And then when it comes to things like visual copyrights and trademarks, merchandise, that's how we make money out of those intellectual property rights. So these are all the different ways that an artist can make money by creating and exploiting intellectual property. Then of course we have live performance on top of that, ticket money and all the other money that comes in on the live side through selling food and drink and other services and sponsorship, the private party circuit. And we have this third area of the music industry, the third set of revenues, which to an extent have always existed, but which have really started to grow in the last 20 years, mainly as a result of direct-to-fan online channels that allow artists to have a much stronger ongoing relationship with core fan base. So merch stall sales online, a fan club, fan funding, tipping services, and brand endorsement would come under this as well, where brands want to get an artist to endorse what they're doing so that that artist's fans will be excited about the brand. So from an artist perspective, these are all ways that you can turn your music making and your fan base into revenue. And of course, artists work with the music industry to make this happen. And we know that in the music industry, there are lots of different kinds of music companies. And most artists, certainly established artists, will be working with lots of different kinds of companies at the same time. So the artist will have a deal with a publisher and a label and a merchandiser. They'll be members of the collecting societies. They'll have an agent and a promoter. They may well be working with a direct-to-fan platform. They may well be working with a brand partnerships agency, all at the same time. But crucially, each of those different business partners is involved in just one of the artist's revenue streams. So the publisher around the song copyright, the label around the recording copyright, collecting societies also the IP rights, merchandise, the visual rights, the trademark, the agent and the promoters on the live side, and the direct-to-fan platforms on fan relationship, brand agencies on brand partnerships. Then of course in the middle of all of that you've got the artist management team or their manager, who is the one business partner involved in every aspect of an artist's career. So each artist has multiple business partners, each focusing on and sharing in a specific revenue stream. Now today we're here to talk about the label. So what is the label involved in? Well, the label is predominantly involved, as I said right at the start, in that one copyright, the recording rights, and all the different ways we can then make money out of those recording rights. So CD, vinyl, streaming, sync, downloads, where music gets played, recorded music gets played in public, etc. But that is the one revenue stream that a record company is traditionally involved in, the recording rights. But I said at the start, although the label, like all the other business partners, with the exception of management, is focused on just one revenue stream, you can argue that the label's role goes beyond just that one revenue stream, because there are two key things that record companies bring to the table once they start working with artists. One is a cash investment, and the other is marketing. And when an artist does a deal with a label, those are the two key things that the artist is usually looking for: investment and marketing. once a label invests and once a label throws its marketing weight behind an artist, that will allow the artist to grow their fan base. Now, of course, artists begin this process long before a label gets involved. Artists begin marketing as soon as they walk out on stage, and then management will play a key role in that. Would usually be on board some time before a label, possibly investing a little bit of money, certainly investing a little time, taking responsibility for some of that early marketing. But generally, once you start working with a label, certainly a traditional label with a traditional record deal, one of the reasons you're doing that as an artist is to get access to more prolific, more extensive, more formalized marketing, to marketing budgets, to marketing contacts. And through that marketing activity, you will escalate the growth of fan base. And once you start growing the fan base, all the other revenue streams start to make more money. Because if more people are listening to the songs, the song rights make more money. More people are buying merch, so the visual rights, trademarks, they're making more money. More people are coming to the shows. Live music's a top-heavy industry. So, as soon as we have a bigger audience, we can get to a bigger capacity venue, live becomes more lucrative. So labels would argue that although they are traditionally only actively involved in one revenue stream, they only share in one revenue stream. The investment and marketing that the label brings to the table grows the entire artist business, and all of the revenue streams benefit. Okay, so let's think now about, well, what is it that record companies do? We know they're focusing on the sound recording, but we also know that they're doing a lot of marketing. So what services does a label bring to the table once they start working with an artist? Now, every label is different. Every label deal is different. But there's a menu of services that most record companies will be bringing to the table when they sign an artist. First of all, there's very often a cash advance as part of a record deal. Not always, but very often. And often from an artist perspective, from a management perspective, it's the cash advance that, well, you can over-exaggerate the importance of the cash advance. Everything else is more important. But often, one of the reasons why an artist looks to bring a label on board is they're getting to that point in their career where things are starting to work, opportunities are starting to emerge, but you need to spend more money in order to make more money. There's a cash flow challenge. And the fact that a label, a publisher also, but a label will advance money, which will ultimately be recouped out of future royalties. But the fact that money will go into the artist's bank account, that might be the money that allows the artist to give up the day job, to focus on their music full time, so that they can capitalize on all of the opportunities that are emerging. But as I say, we can hone too much on the cash advance because there's everything else as well. Once a label is involved with an artist, they will very much take the lead on the recorded music process, the studio process, matchmaking the artist with other artists, with songwriters, with producers, with the best engineers, mastering engineers that are out there. They will oversee the studio process, the recording process. They will work with the artist and with management to work out, once the recording sessions have taken place, what are we doing with the music? Then once the music is made and it's ready, there's the distribution process, getting the music to market. Traditionally, that meant pressing up CDs and vinyl and getting it into record shops. Today, it means getting that music onto all of the digital platforms, the download stores and all of the streaming services. And then there's the marketing stuff. And in some ways, I would argue this is the most important bit. As I say, artists begin marketing way before a label gets involved. But a label with its expertise, its contacts, its budget can bring a whole load of extra marketing to the table. And one of the things with marketing campaigns, there's lots of different tools and tactics that you can employ as part of a music marketing campaign. We have a whole webinar just looking at those different tools and tactics. But actually, if you can employ all those tools and tactics at the same time, you always have a head start. But the problem is, an artist on their own, even an artist with management, usually won't have the time or the budget to do all of those things at the same time. Whereas a label, possibly with its marketing team or with its budget, can allow that to happen. There's other things as well. So for example, once recordings have been made, the label will look for other ways of making money out of those recordings, synchronization being the most obvious. So most labels will offer something like this menu of services. Although we should acknowledge that sometimes a label will have people in-house, employees who do all of this work. Other times, labels might actually outsource some of this work. So they'll have a team that do some of this, but then for other things, they will pay another company, or they will do a deal with another company that includes a revenue share element in order to access third-party services. So for example, Some labels, certainly smaller labels, but sometimes big labels as well, will outsource some or all of the marketing. There are lots of music marketing, music PR, music promotions agencies out there. Generally, they're quite small little enterprises, but labels will sometimes rely on those third-party agencies in order to do some or all of the marketing work. And of course, distribution, getting CDs into record shops, but also getting digital music into the streaming services. A lot of smaller labels will rely on a third-party distributor to do that element of the work. So there we go. Labels offer a range of services. Sometimes they do it all in-house. Sometimes they outsource some of that work. But this is the kinds of things that a label will be bringing to the table once they start working with an artist. So that's nice of the label to do all of that work. Key question, what do they want in return? And every record deal is different. Things do vary a little bit as you go around the world from country to country. But generally speaking, when a label signs an artist, there are three key things that they're looking for in return. First of all, they will want some sort of exclusivity in their relationship with the artist around sound recordings. So what that will mean is once a label has signed an artist, the artist will only work on recorded music with that label for a period of time. The label will probably also want ownership of the copyright in the sound recordings that are created under the deal. Now, the idea of labels taking copyright ownership has been slightly in flux over the last decade, and I'm going to talk more about that later. But certainly a traditional record deal in most countries would have included the label taking ownership of the sound recording copyrights in any of the music created under the deal. And then, of course, the label exploits those copyrights and makes money, and the label expects to keep a portion, possibly most of the money that is generated. So let's just delve into these a little bit more. What do we mean by exclusivity? How long does that exclusivity last for? So an artist is saying to the label, okay, now we've done this deal, we will only work on recorded music, on making recordings of our performances with you and with no one else. But for how long? Well, generally record contracts are for a number of releases. So the artist is obliged to deliver to the label a certain number of tracks, or traditionally, more commonly, it would have been a certain number of albums. It's usually a one-way commitment. So for example, if I sign an artist to a free album deal, they're obliged to deliver me free albums, but I'm not obliged to release free albums. And it may be if the first album doesn't go as well as we would like, that I would cut them free from the deal and I wouldn't take the other albums. Exclusivity may apply on a country-by-country basis, or it may be global. Depends on the deal, the artist, and the size of the label. Although it has to be said, in the digital age, global arrangements are becoming more common. When we talk about copyright ownership, as I say, a traditional record deal with a traditional record company, copyright ownership would definitely be part of the deal. Labels like to own copyright, so that the sound recording copyrights belong to the label, not the artist. Not the publishing rights, remember, there's a separate copyright in the song. Not the visual rights, not the rights in the logo and the other artwork that the artist creates on their own. But when it comes to the sound recording copyright, that will belong to the label. We then have the question of, okay, well, does that mean that the label is going to own the copyright for as long as that copyright exists, which in Europe would be 70 years after release? Or does the label get to own the copyright for a period of time, and then that will then come back to the artist? Copyright law has no opinion on that. So that's to be decided in the deal. It used to be that pretty much all record deals were life of copyright deals. The label would own the copyright in the sound recordings for as long as that copyright existed. We have seen a change in that domain in the independent sector. There are now independent labels who will gladly negotiate on copyright ownership length. So maybe they own the copyright for 20 years and then it reverts to artist. It has to be said, the major labels in the main with new talent deals, of course, if you're a superstar artist, you can always negotiate much, much more favorable terms. But for new talent deals, where even though the artist has done quite a lot of work already, the risks for the label are still much higher, then generally major labels for new talent deals will still be looking for a life of copyright ownership of the rights. But as I say, as we'll see later, some of this is slightly in flux. What about the money? Once the money starts to come in, labels will traditionally seek to take a majority of the money. Now, as it says here, and as I've said several times already, every deal is different. And indeed, there have always been some indie labels who work on a 50-50 revenue share basis. So those deals are out there. But the majors and most of the bigger indies will usually be looking to keep a majority of any income that comes in from the sound recordings. Although, as it says here, the actual revenue share split might differ depending on the revenue stream. So it's sometimes quite common in a record deal for the revenue split on a sync to be 50-50, whereas on a stream, the label might keep 80% of the money. And of course, the other key thing about record deals is that usually the label is allowed to certainly recoup any cash advance that has been provided to the artist. It is, after all, an advance. But a label may also be able to recoup some of its other expenditure, and that will be set out in the deal. If the label pays for videos, maybe it can recoup the costs of the videos. If the label pays for TV advertising, maybe it can recoup the costs of the TV advertising. So all of that needs to be set out in the deal. Okay, this is about the evolution of record deals. And the evolution of record deals has almost gone in two ways. The label taking more and then the label taking least. In the mid-2000s, the value of recorded music started to slump for various reasons. Each year, the record industry was making less money than it was the previous year out of monetizing its sound recordings. And you started to get, by the mid-2000s, labels saying to artists, if we're going to continue to invest and advance you money and do all the marketing, we can no longer afford to do that simply by taking control and the majority of the money on the sound recording revenue stream. So what labels started to say to artists and the managers and lawyers of artists was, everything that used to be part of the deal will still be part of the deal, but we also want to share in some of the other artist revenues. And these were often referred to in record contracts as ancillary revenues. These deals that included other revenue streams were often referred to as 360-degree deals. It's a misleading term because that suggests that suddenly the label is involved in every single revenue stream. And that's not the case. But of course, what this development created was an important question that artists and their managers started to ask, which is, okay, if the label is insisting that it's going to take a cut of another revenue stream, which revenue stream? And how is that going to work? Is it that the label's going to take 10% of our ticket money? So we'll carry on gigging in the same way. The label won't really be involved in that. We've got an agent or work with promoters. But when money comes from the promoter through the agent into the artist's bank account, the artist's fee or the artist's share of ticketing money, maybe the label gets 10% of that. Or is it that the label is going to get involved in the artist's merchandise, but actively involved? The label is actually going to run the artist's merchandise business, but then take 50% of the money that it generates. Different labels had different preferences on this. Different artists had different preferences on this. And it took quite a few years for people to iron this out as to how these multi-revenue stream deals, ancillary revenue deals, 360-degree deals, how they were going to be structured. Of course, initially, artists and managers and lawyers pushed back on this idea that the label should take a cut of other revenue streams. But for new talent deals, they did become the norm. Not all labels did it. There were some independent labels who notably never went this route. Some independents in the electronic music space in particular went for combined rights deals. So they would get involved in the artist's publishing as well as the artist's recordings. Whereas actually with the major labels, they didn't tend to want to do that because, of course, the major labels, the record companies, all have sister publishing businesses, and they didn't want to be seen to competing with their own sister companies. So in the latter part of the 2000s, when artists and managers and artist lawyers started to accept that probably for new talent deals, these ancillary revenues, they were just going to have to be accepted in order to get a label's investment and a label's marketing, then we had a period of like, okay, which revenue streams, how is this going to work? There are still plenty of new talent deals being done today that still includes some element of ancillary revenues. But it has to be said, obviously, for the last 5 years, the record industry has been back in growth. We keep getting press releases from the record industry trade bodies and from the major labels telling us the streaming boom is brilliant, the record industry is making more money every month than the previous month. And as a result of that, we are now starting to see managers and lawyers, when they're negotiating deals for their artists, trying to push the ancillary revenue streams out by basically saying, well, you only got these in the late 2000s because recorded music was in decline. Recorded music is now growing, so therefore we don't see you can justify taking these cuts anymore. Although, if the label has built a merchandise unit or brand partnerships unit from when it first had these ancillary rights in its artist deals, then there may be a benefit to still working with the label on merch or on brand partnerships if it's actually bringing expertise and resource and infrastructure to the table. So, they are still part of the conversation, although in some managers and some lawyers are trying to push these out. Which brings us to the other side of this, that although in the late 2000s labels became more demanding of artists, the trend in the last decade has actually been that artists have more choice and therefore more negotiating power. And one of the key drivers of this is that another key trend we've seen over the last 10-15 years is that distributors who used to predominantly work for labels have started to also work for artists. So distributors have always existed in the CD era and then subsequently in the digital era to help labels, smaller labels who don't have the infrastructure to do this themselves, to get their music to market. But we've started to see distributors working directly with artists. Some distributors have specifically set themselves up to do that. So companies like AWOL, CD Baby, DistroKid, Ditto, Emu Bands, Rootnote, SpinUp, TuneCore, and of course there are more. These are digital distributors who have made artist clients, and in many cases, any artists, DIY artists, their main target customer base. Most of these companies also work with some small labels as well. But, and of course, companies like AWOL operate at multiple levels. Ditto also has a label services business. TuneCore's part of Believe. So, a lot of these companies are doing other stuff as well, but they have a core offer which is aimed specifically at artists and actually at any artist and at DIY artists. But even those distribution companies for whom labels are their core business also have started offering some of their services directly to artists, particularly artists who, through their relationship with their management or possibly relationship with a studio and a producer, in essence have their own label, what I call a single artist label. So they don't need a label because the artist is a label with management and studio support, but they still need somebody to do the heavy lifting. And that is where you've seen all distributors, not just the DIY distributors, starting to work directly with artists. And when an artist is working with a distributor, the deals are different. First of all, because distributors are not in the business of copyright ownership. Distributors are not interested in owning the sound recording copyright. That's not part of their business. So the artist will retain the rights, but then through license, give the distributor usually the exclusive rights to monetize those recordings, possibly across the board or possibly in specific revenue areas like streaming, for example, for a period of time, and then in return for a split of the money. So most distributors work on a revenue share basis. They charge a commission or they take a revenue share. And how big a cut they take will depend on how many services they are offering, also the scale of the artist. Obviously, for a big superstar artist, there's an awful lot of money coming through the system, so they might take a smaller cut because it's still going to be a lot of money, whereas with a slightly newer artist, if they're doing all the work, they might want a bigger cut. But generally with distribution, the artist gets to keep the majority of the money. So whereas with a traditional record deal, the label gets to keep the majority of the money, with distribution, often the artist gets to keep most of the money. And of course, I suppose we should acknowledge with the DIY distributors, some of those actually work on a fee basis rather than a commission basis. They charge a relatively nominal fee up front and then pass 100% of any subsequent revenue on to the artist. The other thing to say about distributors, this is the other key trend we've seen in music distribution over the last decade. Not only did distributors start to diversify their client base, they also started to diversify their service offering. So whereas distributors traditionally were distributors, they did distribution. They got CDs and vinyl into record shops, and they had the relationships with the streaming platforms and the download stores, and they got the digital music online. But we started to see distributors add extra services into the mix. And this had actually been happening for quite a long time. I mean, even in the physical era, most distributors started to offer what we would now call B2B marketing. Back then, we tended to call sales, which basically is not just sending CDs to the record shop, but persuading the record shops to stock the CD, to rack the CD, to push the CD. In the streaming age, this means having relationships with the decision makers at the streaming services, the playlisters, getting the music into the key playlists. But also, are there any other promotional partnerships that can be struck up with the streaming services? And so even in the physical era, that became part of distribution, and certainly in digital, we now call it B2B marketing. It's about representing the artist to the B2B audience at the streaming services. But many distributors started to offer other marketing services too, the things that traditionally you would have expected a label to do. And indeed, some distributors will now advance money. or provide a budget for the recording costs. And some distributors are offering a whole load of other services as well. So you get to the point where some distributors pretty much can offer anything a label would do except A&R, except artist development and overseeing the studio process. Although it has to be said, there are a couple of distributors who are now also offering that service too. So we have this trend of distributors diversifying their client base, but also diversifying the services that they offered. As a result of that, some labels have started to offer artists much more flexible deals. Other labels have launched their own distribution businesses. Some labels already had distribution businesses and they've expanded the existing distribution side of what they do. So there is now some extra flexibility when it comes to negotiating deals with labels because of this commercial pressure from the fact that artists can set up their own labels with management, with a studio, and work with a distributor. So for example, when it comes to copyright ownership, I've already mentioned this. In the independent sector, we've seen a slow shift from life of copyright being the norm, so that the label would control the sound recording copyright for as long as that copyright exists, over to what I call a fixed term assignment, where the label is in control of the recording for a period of time, but then it ultimately reverts back to the artist. Or maybe the artist remains the copyright owner, like they would with a distributor, but they license the rights to the label. They would probably license more rights for longer in this scenario than if they were working with a distributor, but nevertheless, there is some flexibility out there. Although, as I said, major labels still like life of copyright ownership when signing new talent and taking a big financial risk. So although there is more flexibility, there is also some expectations on behalf of labels that copyright ownership will be part of their deal, and for major labels that it may well be life of copyright. What about revenue share? Lots of artists will tell you that it's unfair that labels get to keep often, depending on the deal, but often 80% of the money that comes in from things like streaming services. A lot of artists will say that, okay, maybe labels got to keep 85% of CD money, but there was a lot of costs and hassle involved in releasing physical products. How can they justify still taking 80% on a stream? But it has to be said, over the last 50 years, artist royalties have, albeit very slowly, increased. So, you know, in the 60s and the 70s, artists were signing deals with single-figure royalties, and they slowly increased up to 15% on a CD, and then a little bit higher on digital. Some will now offer 20% on a stream. Of course, there are still indie labels that do a 50-50 rev share, but I'm talking here really about the deals involving majors and the bigger indies. When it comes to the conventions on royalties, it does sometimes differ slightly from country to country, and those figures I've just given you, they're kind of UK skewed. So there are some slight different conventions, but it is certainly the case that in most markets, a major label and a bigger indie will be looking to keep a majority of the money, but there is a little bit more flexibility on that than there used to be. And as a result of that, as a result of all of these trends, of the distributors working directly with artists, the distributors offering more services, and then the labels becoming more flexible as a result, we're now in a position where when an artist is ready to work with somebody, a company, on their recordings, there is now a much bigger choice of deals to be done, a much bigger choice of companies that you could work with. Here at CMU, we did some work with the Music Managers Forum a couple of years ago to produce the MMF Deals Guide. And in that, we crunched all of the different contracts and offerings and service provisions that are out there when it comes to artists looking for business partners to work with on recordings. And we identified at least 10 different kinds of deals that can be done, starting off with working with the distributors and then working with labels. So just to very quickly go through these 10. A DIY distributor like a TuneCore that charges you a fee, just does basic distribution, but gives you 100% of the money. First is a DIY distributor like CD Baby, who takes a commission, so reducing some of the upfront costs because there's a commission element to what they do. Through to a DIY distributor that offers extra little bits for the artist. There are some DIY distributors that will advance money. Not straight away, not to any artist by any means, but if you're gaining some traction with your streams, it may be that the DIY distributor, as I say, not all, but some, will advance some money to the artist. That then brings us to a more conventional distributor who will offer extra services, more of that B2B marketing, probably a bigger advance. Then we have those distributors that throw in the marketing services and the other services into the mix. Then we have doing a distribution deal, or what you might call a services deal or a licensing deal with a label. And then we have more traditional record deals, a 50-50 profit share model, signing to an indie, signing to a major. So 10 different deal types to choose from. And the key thing here is, as we work our way up this list of different deals, the number of services you get increases. So we start off with just getting digital distribution, and then maybe a little cash advance as well. Then we get some B2B marketing thrown in. Maybe the distributor can help with physical distribution as well. Then we get some more marketing services being thrown into the mix. All the marketing services being thrown into the mix, until we get to a more traditional label deal where everything is brought to the table. One extra thing I should add, sometimes when you simply look at the list of services, you can sometimes think, well, actually, if I have a full-on distribution deal where maybe I get to keep certainly 50% of the money, maybe even up to 60, 70% of the money, even though I'm getting all of the services, versus a label deal where the label keeps 80% of the money, well, hang on a second, what's going on there? And I think the thing to say about a traditional label deal is that actually often the value that the label brings to the table is above and beyond the list of services that might be set out in the record contract. That when a label really throws itself behind an artist and a release, it can really open doors. And it's the extra stuff often that is the real value. And I know some managers, we all know, artist managers love slagging off major labels. They do it for fun. But I know some managers who will spend an hour slagging off a major label, but then admit that when a major label deal works, it really works. Not because of the services that the major label is obliged to deliver under contract, but because of everything else that the major label throws at the artist and the release. But because they're not contractually obliged to do that, sometimes you get the extras and sometimes you don't. And I'm kind of getting into this, aren't I? 10 different deal types. There are pros and cons of every deal type. But the basic principle is this, that as we work our way up the different deal types, the amount of services we're receiving from the distributor and then from the label increases, both in terms of the services that the label is contractually obliged to deliver and the services that are thrown in for extra. But crucially, what this slide is showing is as the services go up at the top, the share of the money at the bottom, the share of the money going to the artist goes down. So as more services are thrown into the mix, the label / distributor gets to keep more of the money until we get to the classic major label deal. Lots of services brought to the table, extra services, contacts, resources thrown in for good measure. But the label will have life of copyright, ownership of the recordings, and will keep 80% of the money. Which brings us to this final point. In some ways, the evolution of record deals and sort of the evolution of music distribution, the rise of what we sometimes call label services, and label services is a slightly confusing term, but often that's the word that is used by distributors to describe the fact that they're offering all of these extra services. Some distributors now don't like the term label services and talk about artist services, but that's kind of semantics. But all of these developments are actually quite exciting for artists and managers, because when you're looking for somebody to work with on your recordings, there's more choice. And because there's more choice, there's more chance of finding the deal that's exactly right for the artist at that time. And also, there's more negotiating power when it comes to rights ownership and revenue share. So, in some ways, this has been hugely liberating for artists. And this continues, this evolution continues. As every year goes by, the choices for the artists and their management teams go up. But the challenge is, now we've got to make some tricky decisions. And I think when artists and managers are working out what kind of distributor or label they want to work with, the first question they have to ask is, well, what services do we need and what are we willing to give up in order to access those services? Obviously, putting a little bit of reality check in there. And if we're going to take fewer services, and that's one of the good developments. It used to be, to an extent, that the label would just throw all the services in even if you didn't want them. Whereas now you can, with a distributor and with some labels, you can say, well, we don't want that service or that service or that service, but we do want this service and this service. So can we take fewer services and get a better deal? But I suppose from an artist and management perspective, you have to ask yourself, if you're taking fewer services, does that mean that you're just doing less activity? Maybe some of the things the label was proposing to do don't need to be done. Or are we proposing that somebody else is going to do the work instead of the label? And if so, who? And if management are going to take up the slack, and sometimes, maybe even a lot of the time, management do take up the slack, well, does that mean we now need to rethink management deals? Is the manager still charging their 20% commission? Or if they're actually now doing some of the work of the label, should they be getting some of the money that previously would have belonged to the label? And this is a big conversation going on in the management community, because a lot of managers are starting to think, as the workload of managers increases, that traditional 20% model no longer works. And the last thing I would say when it comes to choosing a label and deciding which of these approaches works best, and whether or not you keep all the rights, you keep all the work in-house, and you just work with a very basic distribution arrangement where you get to keep nearly all of the money. Once an artist truly starts to go global, some extra considerations need to be made. Once an artist has a global fan base, it really helps to have an on-the-ground presence, expertise, contacts, champions in the key priority markets for the artist. And the question is, can management do that on their own? Can the distributor do that? Now, some distributors are global. Maybe they can. But sometimes this is where labels, and I have to say, major labels, can really come into their own, because they have on-the-ground presence in the key markets, and providing they genuinely bring that presence to the table, sometimes they don't, but providing they do, then that could justify them taking rights ownership and a much bigger cut of the money. And that brings us to the end of this speedy briefing on the evolution of record deals and the artist-label relationship, which I think means it's time now to answer some of your questions. Yes, let's answer some questions. Lots of questions have been coming in while we have been going through the main presentation today. So I say we are running slightly behind. I do apologize for that, but I'm going to answer a few questions. If you do need to log off bang on 3:20, then don't forget, we will send you the link to where you can listen to the recording on demand, the entire thing, including the Q&A. But a few questions that came in during the presentation. One person said, if the record label is just one of many business partners that the artist works with, how did they become responsible for so much of the risk involved in developing new artists with things like marketing, press, PR, strategy, etc.? Interesting question. I suppose I should initially say there are plenty of managers who would argue that labels exaggerate the risk they take compared to everybody else. So managers, and indeed some promoters and publishers, would say, actually, do you know what, we're risk takers as well, and that labels have done a very good job of PRing themselves as being the only risk takers, when actually other companies are investing certainly time, even if they are not investing money, and in some cases they are actually putting money in as well. But at the same time, I think it is true that once an artist reaches a certain point in their career and you want significant investment, significant cash, significant marketing, labels traditionally, and to an extent still, take a significant risk at the point at which they get involved. Not all indies, some indies are taking a relatively modest risk, but then will give you lots of rights ownership and bigger share of the money in return. But I think, labels are amongst the biggest risk takers once they get involved. So how did that end up being? Well, I'm always going to reverse the question and say, well, why did the primary risk taker, or the biggest risk taker, I should probably say, not primary, why did one of the biggest risk takers decide to secure their investment on the sound recording revenue stream rather than anything else? And I think there were two reasons for that. In the mid-20th century, when the music industry was really becoming formalized, it was the most lucrative revenue stream. When a record went big, it went really big. And also, it's a revenue stream that's kind of quite secure. Obviously, investing in music is always a risky business, because you can do everything right and the album not take off and it not sell. But when a record does take off and does sell, you can then carry on selling that record for the foreseeable future, for the 70 years that copyright provides the protection, 95 years in the US. And the artist's ongoing involvement isn't required. So as a label, ultimately, you can part company with the artist. You can horrifically fall out with the artist. The artist can die, and you can still monetize that intellectual property asset. Whereas if you're working on the live side of the business, you have to have a good relationship with the artist. There's lots of ongoing costs with touring. And obviously, once the artist retires or dies, then we can't make any more money out of it. So I think those were the reasons why the companies that became the biggest investors in new talent, the labels, secured that investment on the sound recording revenue stream. Although I'll just very quickly, again, because I can hear in my head managers and publishers and promoters saying that they're certainly not the only investor. But, at the same time, labels can put significant investment in at just the right time. Somebody asked me about the major record companies' label services divisions or distribution divisions. So for Sony, that would be the Orchard. For Warner, ADA. Universal, Caroline, although Universal does also now own Ingrooves. And what is the relationship between them and labels that are part of the same corporate entities? And I think earlier I was talking about sometimes you can look at a distribution deal that has a lot of services but offers you 70% of the money, and a label deal that has lots of services but only offers you 20% of the money. Well, what's the going on here? And I think that's a good example. Orchard are offering you one deal over here, and a Sony label like Columbia is offering you another deal over here. And I think, again, it's the everything else that a label brings to the table. Even a really good distributor, realistically, they can bring services to the deal. They will adjust to the commission accordingly. And some distributors doing a really good job of things like marketing, etc. But labels often throw a whole load more at the deal. Also, some labels have their own brands, their own reputation. If you sign to my label, then people will like you because you're associated with me. And some indies in particular, I mean, I'm thinking of the Ninja Tunes and the Warps of this world. They are a brand in their own right, and to be associated with that brand is really valuable. So I think in terms of, yes, you can go and access the distribution infrastructure and some of the marketing expertise of the majors through the Orchard and ADA and Caroline, but you won't get everything thrown at the release in the same way as you would by signing to a label. Usually, I interviewed the boss of Warner's ADA at Reeperbahn a couple of years ago, and he did admit that when Warner were trying to sign Stormzy, just as grime was exploding, because Stormzy had done a lot of the work without any formal label support, and because the grime community had become very DIY, partly because initially nobody was interested in the grime community, and by the time they were, they'd already got a bit of infrastructure going. Stormzy didn't want to sign to a Warner Music record company, but they needed distribution, they needed marketing support, so they did a deal with ADA. But within the corporate group, ADA were told, throw everything at this artist. Here's Atlantic's promotions team. Here's Atlantic's marketing team. They would not normally be part of an ADA deal, but for this artist, throw everything at it because we want to sign Stormzy to a more conventional deal with the album. So sometimes you get the extras through the distribution divisions, but it's not guaranteed, and I would say it's the exception rather than the norm. Just a couple more questions, and then we will wrap up. So what have we got here? Can you give an example of a successful artist who went down the distribution route and not the major label route? Oh, well, I mean, I would see quite a lot of the artist point there. So like take someone like Stormzy, who had a huge amount of success on his own, decided in essence self-release his first album, but with ADA's backing. Why did he then sign a more conventional deal with Warner? Was it because the ruse of giving all the extras as part of the ADA worked? Really, I think that comes back to the global thing, that there are plenty of artists who have brilliant management, good distribution, can do everything themselves in the UK. Why would they give up such a big portion of the revenue in order to access a label? Because they want to break America. And, most managers would be honest enough to say, do you know what, to break America, we need the help of a label with a presence there, and the major labels can give us that. Somebody asked me about digital revenue shares. I think presumably meaning, what are the splits on a stream between a label and an artist. I hope I've understood that question correctly. And I think in the main, when digital first came along, a lot of labels just applied the CD royalty to digital, which was 15% for sort of newer deals. But there has been pressure on the labels to increase that. So I think most labels now will be offering somewhere closer to 20% on the stream, although every deal is different. Some indies will offer more. Beggars Group famously, when streaming first came along, offered to do it on a 50-50 split on all deals, oblivious of what the deals said, but then subsequently reduced it. Once streaming became the revenue stream, Beggars said to their artists, we just can't make it work giving you 50% of streaming. So I think the Beggars rate now is sort of in the mid-20s, although I need to check that out. One last question, and then we will wrap it up. Although, as I said, we will do a written Q&A as well. So if I haven't answered your question, I apologize, but we'll do it in the write-up. Somebody's got a little newsworthy thing. We began with a news story. Let's end with a news story. The Hypnosis Fund that has been announced yesterday or this morning that they've taken 70% of Mark Ronson's song catalogue. How can they buy the catalogue if Ronson songs are already in copyright with another company? Well, slightly off topic, but it's an interesting question. So I'll answer this and then we'll wrap up. When you have people buying rights from artists who are established and have already done deals with publishers and labels, etc., it can mean one of two things. Firstly, with publishing deals, life of copyright has not been the norm in the UK for a very long time. It differs from country to country, but in the UK now, life of copyright deals on the song side of the business are almost unheard of. They do occasionally happen, but they're almost unheard of. And it's been like that for more than 20 years. So there is a very high chance that Mark Ronson did a publishing deal. The publisher had 15 years control of the copyright, and then they reverted to Ronson, and Ronson has now done the new deal. So with song rights, if the original deal was 21st century, chances are in the UK, some of Europe, it would still be life of copyright. But in the UK, it would be a fixed term assignment, so you can have the option to it reverts back to the writer, and then they can go and do another deal. Where that's not the case, sometimes people buy into a royalty share rather than a right share. So there may well be that another publisher controls the copyright, but the songwriter has a rev share under their deal. And generally with publishing deals, it's always stacked the other way around. The majority of the money will go to the writer, subject to advances being recouped. So let's say you're on a 75% royalty as a songwriter. You might then sell a share in your royalty. So you'll say to a company, give me 100 grand up front and I'll give you 50% of my royalty share, not 50% of the copyright, because the copyright already belongs to somebody else, but 50% of my revenue share on that copyright. And we've seen an increasing number of those deals being done, particularly in the US in recent years. On the back of the streaming boom, there's renewed interests in music rights as something that maybe people want to invest in. And so we are seeing different deals. But it's a very good question. Whenever those deals get press released to us, actually, that's not true. Quite often we just announce the announcement. But when I catch up with those companies, I ask that question. What exactly have you bought into? Is it rights? Is it revenue share? And, you know, how did that happen? What happened to the original publisher, etc., etc. Anyway, look at that. Our time is well and truly up. So we'll wrap things up there. But thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you found this lockdown webinar useful. For those of you who've done all three, thank you for tuning in each day. We have 6 more of these already on sale. Some of you already booked in, all 6. So for some of you, I'll see you back here Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday next week. Little secret here, we have some new webinars being announced coming at the end of that fortnight. Out for an announcement on that in the CMU Daily tomorrow. Some final logistical things. Don't forget, we will send you an email shortly, which will have a link to where you can download the slides and a link to where you can watch the recording on demand. One person mentioned in the chat that they didn't receive that yesterday. If you can drop an email to Sam, we'll make sure that you get that. We're also going to send you a link to a survey. These webinars are new format. We've done webinars before, but not quite in this format. So we're really interested in your feedback. So if you do have, it will take you 98 seconds to fill out. It's not a very long questionnaire. Your feedback much appreciated, and everybody who fills it out in the next few weeks, we're going to put them in a hat and give away a £50 Amazon voucher at the end of it. So please do sign up for that. Hey, that's it. Don't forget to download the slides. If you want to rewatch it, why not rewatch it? And have a great rest of Thursday. Have a great weekend. And for those of you in it for the long haul, we'll see you next week for more CMU Insights lockdown webinars. Goodbye.